Hello and welcome to What's Happening in South Africa. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we're so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. Whether you're joining us live or viewing the recording later, we invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other upcoming events and how to join the IRC as a member on our website at irckc.org. IRC members are warmly invited to join one or more IRC Roundtables, a chance to connect with other members, talk about current events in regions of interest to you, and help inform IRC programming. Roundtable members will be invited to a quarterly meeting and receive IRC event information and other updates relevant to the regions they select. Roundtables are open to all members of the IRC, including individual and family members and individuals affiliated with IRC organizational members, like businesses, colleges and universities, and nonprofits. Be as involved as your schedule allows without worrying about whether you can make a meeting or meet a deadline. The point is to connect, explore, and engage. More information is online at irckc.org. With so much going on right now, it's easy to lose track of what's happening around the world, especially in places that have fallen out of the headlines or where news stories are increasingly complicated. We can't predict the future, but we do know the importance of understanding historical background and current global context. No matter your level of expertise, the What's Happening series offers meaningful explorations on some particularly active parts of the globe. We invite you to deepen your global knowledge and nuance your understanding of what's happening around the world today as we explore what's happening in South Africa. We certainly welcome your thoughtful questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen. And do check out and share other IRC conversations as we consider a range of critical issues in the coming weeks. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for today's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us to navigate the conversation. Rodney Uphoff is the Elwood L. Thomas Missouri Endowed Professor of Law at the University of Missouri, an IRC organizational member, where he's also served as the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs for 3 years. In 2006, he was selected to be the director of the University of Missouri's South Africa Educational Program, representing the 4 University of Missouri system campuses. He also directs the School of Law Study Abroad program in Cape Town, South Africa. Professor, thank you so much for being with us today. Please take it away.
Thank you, Matthew. I'm delighted to be a part of this presentation. I'm going to introduce our speaker for tonight. That's Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. He's the former South African ambassador to the United States. He also was the premier of the Western Cape, which is essentially the governor of the Western Cape province. He had been a member of the National Parliament in South Africa. He was a special advisor to the president. Since stepping down as ambassador, he's been a distinguished scholar in residence at Georgetown University, and he's the founder of an NGO called World for All Foundation, which endeavors to create a world of coexistence that is safe for difference. A graduate of the University of Cape Town, he's been the recipient of many awards from many organizations across the globe. I'm delighted to introduce Ambassador Rasool. Ambassador Rasool.
Thank you very much to you, Professor Uphoff, for that very generous introduction, and to Matthew Hughes for the IRC hosting such an important discussion. I think that sometimes the world has an attention span for one crisis or one event at a time. And so it's particularly useful to speak to this very provocative topic, what's happening in South Africa. and so much is happening, and not all very good news. South Africa has had a changing narrative over 350 years. I think we all are familiar with the travesty of apartheid, with its history of discrimination and dispossession of Black people in South Africa who were not white, the systematized discrimination that was built into it. People also have great narratives about the heroic struggle led by outstanding leaders who were followed by a courageous people in the fight for justice, but not just courageous, because that's what defined the South African people differently. It was courageous in the most disciplined way, in which the default position was non-violence in the opposition of apartheid. And then people watched in that heroic struggle and then participated. One of the biggest anti-apartheid movements globally was the US anti-apartheid movement, spanning almost all states in the USA, involving almost all people, whether it was the refusal to eat a South African apple, or whether it was the dock workers in San Francisco who refused to offload a South African ship, or whether it was the unique combination of a Republican and a Democratic members of Congress and Senate who vetoed the veto by President Reagan to introduce the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act. I mean, that's how deep the connection is between South Africa and the United States and its people. And then the US proudly looked at the remarkable transition that captured the imagination of the world as Nelson Mandela stepped out of prison, entered into a negotiating process, created a government of national unity with his erstwhile jailers, and then set about the reconstruction of South Africa. And then to watch the triumph of the human spirit through almost 2 decades of democracy and freedom in South Africa, in which leaders who were jailed by and maimed by an evil regime rose above their anger to embrace and to reconcile. How people who had sacrificed so much mustered enormous patience. Even while their poverty persisted, they lived on the hope of a better future. And so how we built a society that was not just fundamentally inclusive, but reconciled, and how the United States helped to rally to the call for an economic reconstruction in South Africa, to the extent that today there are 600 plus minus US companies invested in South Africa, settled in South Africa, employing almost 250,000 people and adding enormously to the growth and development of South Africa. I think this history makes it all the more puzzling to read news about South Africa today, where we stand at a fundamental crossroads between the hope we were for the world and the disappointment we may have become in the eyes of many. That we stand at this crossroads between the renaissance we promised to not only bring to South Africa, but bring to Africa, bring to the developing world as a whole, and then succumbing to the human frailties and the human temptations of matters like corruption. And then also how we manage the unfair burden of the baggage that apartheid had given us, the color-coded dispossession, the color-coded poverty, the color-coded inequality that we were bequeathed by apartheid. People could understand the gradual way in which we try to remove that yoke from our neck. But people today can't understand how we added a series of self-inflicted blows on ourselves and on our nation through what has been called a decade of state capture, in which we mortgaged our state and our resources to the most corrupt, not only amongst ourselves, but also in the rest of the world. Yes, we did have pathologies in that first 2 decades in which we were gifted with the leadership of Nelson Mandela, and we had the leadership of Thabo Mbeki, who may have been eccentric, but not corrupt. And we did have poverty, we did have inequality, we did have unemployment, we did have violence amongst ourselves, we did have the persistence of discrimination, we did have violence against women and children. But we saw that as the inheritance and from which we had to heal ourselves. Yes, we did have the temptation in those first 2 decades, because it was under Mandela's watch that some thought that they could benefit from an arms deal and get proceedings from it which were illicit. There were members of the Black leadership who joined the kind of monopolies on the other side, rather than simply doing the best for their people. Yes, there were policy disappointments, such as the ones on HIV and AIDS, but we saw these as deviations from our default position, which was innately good. And then, of course, we did have the COVID-19 epidemic or pandemic that came along. It did exacerbate the assault on lives and livelihoods, but it did not necessarily cause the situation that we are in today. But this period after 2010 is seen as this period in which South Africa derailed itself, went off the rails, succumbed to a number of pathologies, corruption, not only individual corruption, but the corrupting and the distortion of the institutions of our society, particularly the economic and the security institutions of our society, assault on the wonderful institute. We were teaching the world how to maximize revenue generation, how to commit people to pay their fair share, and suddenly we raided it and descended it. The impunity at the top in the presidency in South Africa led to an impunity on the ground. Taxi drivers not respecting even the red traffic lights. Ordinary people beginning to live with a sense of impunity. What you can get away with, you do. Our social cohesion fragmented, because that social cohesion that made us manage our ongoing poverty and our inequality and our hunger and the lack of infrastructure, when that went away, when number one stole, number 5 million did not care what the rest of society needed from them. But most importantly, our policy coherence, the predictability of our policy, the hard policies that were counter-instinctive in our society, such as not grabbing land, such as not wanting the death penalty. Suddenly it gave rise to populism, winning votes with enormous promises of giving people land, paying for all higher education, etc., etc. And most importantly, the biggest casualty was a noble 100-year-old ANC, African National Congress, that had captured the imagination of the world, led the world in this fight against global racism as they fought South African racism. And suddenly, this ANC lost the trust of its people and the people of the world. This ANC fragmented and started eventually to decay. And so those were the kind of issues that are perplexing this world who believed in us. And so we had this abiding catchphrase of state capture, because outsiders to the elected leadership were making decisions about our resources. We had this fig leaf to cover our shame by calling it radical economic transformation, which was nothing but a fig leaf for looting the state in the name of a noble cause. And the impatience of our people were being exploited with fine-sounding, manufactured in a place in London by a global brand firm. We had outcomes, the negative drivers, negative outcomes and impacts on the drivers of our economy. Suddenly, we were facing a collapsing energy supplier, and blackouts or load shedding became increasingly the norm, and our industry sputtered. The rail could not move our goods to the harbors. If the goods came to the harbors, they waited in long queues, because these were the targets of corruption and state capture. How do you inflate the prices and reduce the services and collapse the infrastructure and the logistics of the state. The roads were filled with potholes because the maintenance budgets were being siphoned off. And so the corruption is estimated to have cost South Africa over the last decade at least 1.5 trillion rands. I don't know how to subtract the dots to make it into dollars. Accompanied by a weak rand, a recession, the downgrades to junk even by the economic ratings agencies. Our GDP, we projected at 1.8% growth per annum, but it turns out in reality to be much less than that. Our unemployment was exacerbated by COVID. We lost 1.4 million jobs during the last 2 years of COVID, but we were already at the 30% unemployment rate. We are now going towards a 40% unemployment rate. That deepened poverty, that deepened the inequality, that deepened the social pathologies in our society. Our political cohesion splattered. The ANC benefits only because on the right side of it, the Democratic Alliance has gobbled up all its rivals, but it has reached a ceiling of 28%. They can run Johannesburg in coalition. They can run metros in coalition, but their threat to the government is not that significant, but you don't have it. On the left, you've got the displacement effect. There's only 10% really available, and at the moment, it is populated by the most populist rabble-rousers amongst us. And so, to end, what has kept us sane during this period, what has kept us sane and breathing and surviving during this period has been the fact that Mandela's generation bequeathed us a durable constitution that is justiciable. We've got an activist judiciary that doesn't kowtow to the legislature and to the executive. We've got an investigative journalism who values their free speech and their right of expression and exercises it. We've got an alert civil society. Sometimes it gets it right, sometimes it's single issue, but you always know they're watching. You've got a fiercely independent treasury in government. Had it not been for treasury, more of our country may have been mortgaged off in the period of state capture. And you've got this hope that our development is tied to the development on the African continent, that as we stand now, South Africa remains the gateway for 600 US companies into the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. And those are the things that give us hope. What gives us the reason to start believing again is the rise of President Cyril Ramaphosa. His problem may be timidity, but his gift could be honesty. But timidity and honesty often cancel each other out if we don't deal with his need for courage. We can see already, for example, one of the major companies that comes out of Kansas City, Black & Veatch, have tried their best to keep the lights on in South Africa. And we can now see that Black & Veatch was surrounded by scoundrels who are now, thank God, coming to court, being charged and faced with jail. The key managers who were the interlocutors to a company like Black & Veatch are now facing their day in court. Hopefully that's the start of our revival. The purification of our institutions, it's beginning to happen. The payback by companies from the ill-gotten gains. I mean, McKinsey alone paid back 1 billion rands to the treasury in South Africa. That's how deep it is, and the complicity globally. And so we're beginning to clean out. We're beginning to capture, but the road back is very heavy. Unfortunately, our political leaders are too distracted and inward looking to place the country always as at the apex of the priorities. And so the one thing that keeps our people from rebellion during these difficult times is the fact that South Africa has a safety net. That every month, people over 60 get a pension. Children under 18 get a child support grant. There are free education for some, there's free healthcare for others in a crumbling institution. But those are really the toe holes in our society that keeps us believing and that gives us the hope that we can turn this around. And so it's been really great being able to speak to this august body, the International Relations Council of Kansas City. I've been with you a few years ago. I've come to see Black and Veatch. I've been to the University of Missouri. I've gone to a wonderful theater that is in Kansas City. I've crossed between the two Kansas cities and the two states, and I have great memories of what it is. And so when I open my heart and I unburden myself to a group like Kansas City International Relations Council, then I do so because I believe that I am amongst friends who can believe with me. Thank you very much for this, Professor.
Ambassador Rasool, that was an incredibly terrific summary of the complexity of what South Africa has endured since, and I'm gonna date it since 2010 because I was fortunate. I've been in South Africa since 2002, and I now own a home here in South Africa. And I remember in 2010 when the World Cup was here, and the world's focus was on South Africa. And the South Africans put on an incredible World Cup. And I remember talking to many Americans who were here visiting, who were talking about what an amazing place Cape Town was, and how amazing it was to be in South Africa. And I think at that point there was a lot of, a lot of enthusiasm after the World Cup about how South Africa could move in a very positive direction. Crime, which has been a problem for South Africa for a long period of time. Crime in 2010 was virtually, for the 30 days of the World Cup, there was virtually no crime at all in South Africa. So everyone was very optimistic. There was a lot of, I think, feeling that South Africa was the most prosperous, prominent economy, and in a very good place, had a wonderful infrastructure, and it was time to move forward. But I'd like you to speak a little bit more about state capture. You spoke about that, but I think there have been hearings in state capture for years now in South Africa. And if you could just tell the folks a little bit more about how firms got in and what they did to essentially suck as much money from the South African people as they did. Talk a little bit more about state capture, if you would.
Look, you can speak about state capture in its greatest breadth, but let me confine myself, for example, to the energy sector in which Kansas City has given of its finest brains to us to build the Madupe and Kusile power plants that, if they come on stream, they could solve quite a lot of South Africa's baseload energy problems in South Africa. But what state capture did there, for example, was that you had a president who micromanaged who could be the head of energy in South Africa and put his own person in. That person made sure that the persons who worked with Black and Veatch, for example, in the building of that, would get their preferred bidders in. They'd inflate the price beyond what it would cost. And that would be the portion that would go back to all of those in the corrupt cycle. They would buy the wrong parts because the specifications didn't matter. And therefore you've got these constant breakages and breakdowns at these power stations because the boilers were not made, for example, to the specification that the engineers and Black and Veatch would have wanted them to do it, but Black and Veatch, unfortunately, I think Black and Veatch had enough of a paper trail to show how they dissented with all of those kind of decisions. And so what that meant was that billions went for corrupt purposes. Very little of that when to really build the electricity and the energy infrastructure of the country. What is happening now is that we are facing this thing of load shedding, where to manage the wrong parts and the wrong specifications, to manage the constant breakdowns, even the coal that is supplied were taken away from historical suppliers in the name of advancing Black empowerment, given to foreign, in this case, Indian mining companies who sold inferior coal, for example, to the power stations, which if it got wet, it was unusable, and then the lights would go out in South Africa. So that's just a very tangible, real way to make state capture land. And so, for example, the first thing that happened as Jacob Zuma was replaced as president by Cyril Ramaphosa was to appoint the Deputy Chief Justice, Raymond Zondo, at the head of a commission that sat for 3 years, taking evidence, listening to people, subpoenaing information, getting this whole picture. And since the beginning of 2022, they've now submitted 3 or 4 reports to the president, all of which, as the president receives the report, it goes into the public domain. The newspapers get it, people, ordinary people can read it. So that transparency is very important. And the state now has the responsibility to decide how to prosecute. But we couldn't prosecute unless we cleaned up the National Prosecuting Authority, because that was one of the key institutions that were captured. It wasn't money-making, but it was making sure that the corrupt don't get charged. And so it was perverted. And so in a sense, I think we are now going to have to see how we do it. And so I think this, what the president is doing, he is doing a combination of getting good people into your prosecuting authorities and outsourcing to private sector players as well in order to make charges stick. We may not have the resources to prosecute everyone, but I do think we would have to have the resources to go after the commanding heights of corruption in South Africa. So that's just a quick tour of state capture in South Africa.
So why don't you talk a little bit about President Zuma, because it may be a surprise to our listeners, but former President Zuma actually went to prison last year, although his stay in prison was pretty short, but he was sentenced to prison. And I think that speaks to one of the other points you made about the fact that South Africa has an independent, strong judiciary.
I think absolutely that was a great sign that the courts could find him guilty of contempt of court because he refused to present himself. You see, what is done, we call it, and it's based on this World War II Battle of Stalingrad, where it was toe-to-toe, sniper by sniper warfare. And that's the strategy that Jacob Zuma has legally employed to stay out of prison and to delay his court appearances until the court charged him with contempt of court. He didn't pitch up and they found him guilty, and then they took him to prison. 2 things happened as a result. A riot or an insurrection was engineered in his home province that caused massive devastation, economic devastation, and devastation of human lives in KwaZulu-Natal, and it hasn't recovered since. But it also showed that when one of his appointees, who was the head of intelligence under him, he became the head of prisons. And one of Zuma's appointees manufactured a health report that said that there was imminent danger of Zuma dying and he was terminally ill, and that therefore he used his discretion to release him. So the point is that we are beginning to see how deep the capture of the state has become, when a functionary of the state can undermine the decision of a judiciary. And so it also then shows us how difficult it is going to be to bring to book all of those people, because you're beginning to understand it is not a few naughty individuals or corrupt individuals. They have embedded themselves in the system, and the system needs to immunize itself against capture.
Right. So President Zuma has been facing a trial for arms dealing for many, many years, and it keeps getting postponed all the time. And it was supposed to start again, but his lawyer's latest maneuver is to try to get the head prosecutor, Billy Downer, removed, and they have used that tactic to delay the trial. It should have been going on 2 or 3 years ago, and it still isn't going on. Is that trial ever going to take place, and is he ever going to be held accountable for those charges?
Just this week, the Supreme Court of Appeal, to which Jacob Zuma had turned to get rid of the prosecutor, which I mean is preposterous by anyone. You can't choose your defense and your opponent in a case, but that's what it's trying to do. But fortunately, the head of the Supreme Court of Appeals, Justice Maya, has dismissed as frivolous this attempt and has ruled that this case should now proceed within the next month. And we are now hoping, we suspect that Jacob Zuma in his Stalingrad strategy will try one more toss at the final court, which is the Constitutional Court, to have this matter heard. So we should budget for another 2 months, possibly, but hopefully he will now rest on this issue. But what it shows is that he is not short of financial support to mount one case after the other, because there are so many people, so many of them, unfortunately, heroes of the liberation struggle, who fear that if Jacob Zuma is not wholly enough to stay out of prison, that they will similarly not be treated with any respect, having besmirched their names and their reputations in this process. So we have to remind President Ramaphosa that when he negotiated on behalf of Nelson Mandela, the National Party, the Apartheid Party, out of power, he was negotiating with a party that had seen the end and were beginning to think about how best they can live their next life. In this case, these heroes of liberation are not seeing defeat. For them, this is going to be absolute humiliation and disgrace, and their entire legacy would be removed if they were to go to jail. And therefore, they have shown their preparedness to bring about an insurrection, if necessary, in order for them personally to stay out of prison. So South Africa is in a very tenuous place, but the fact that they are mustering those forces is also a tribute to the fact that they feel the noose beginning to tighten around their necks.
And that's really what happened in KZN last year and in Durban, wasn't it?
No, that's it. The July Riots. It coincided almost exactly with the time that Jacob Zuma was imprisoned. That was the moment they struck. And again, we need to make sure that the prosecutors and the investigators of the causes and the people and the instigators of those riots and insurrection are not based in KwaZulu-Natal, because KwaZulu-Natal is a hodgepodge of loyalties, of political loyalties, of ethnic loyalties. They may have benefited out of the Zuma years, and therefore they feel that if there's another leader, that they will take their place in the queue again. And so all in all, I think we need to navigate these very difficult and dangerous times in South Africa.
Yeah, absolutely. So talk a little bit about COVID, because I think that at least some people were very impressed with how President Ramaphosa handled the COVID crisis. And maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about the contrast between mask wearing in South Africa and the different experience that many of us had in the United States regarding mask wearing.
I must say that watching COVID in the United States from our lockdown at home, when the shopping centers were closed and only opened under strict conditions where you could go nowhere without your mask, public transport was restricted. If I could call it that, the kind of light relief came from watching the daily briefings by the US government on COVID-19, the ridiculous things that were being said, the denialism within it, so in a sense, a country with the United States' resources should never have this disproportionate burden of illness and deaths that the United States has. The fact that a poor country in deep trouble, as I've just explained, like South Africa, could minimize its deaths and its exposures and could mount a successful social campaign to wear masks, to observe social distance, to make sacrifices, I think that it speaks about a very unfortunate period in the life of the United States of America, that you almost had two waves coinciding, with three waves: a wave of populist governance, a wave of a pandemic, and then the rise of ignorance into respectable public spaces again, and the demise of science and technical competence as the yardstick for what needed to be done. The United States did not need buffoonery as these triple waves hit it. And so maybe I think that the fact of the matter is that the result is that extremism has been mainstreamed in the United States. It's taken up respectable office. It's got public discourse. It is not on Comedy Central. It's on the news every night. And that is a very unfortunate situation for the US to find itself in.
Yeah, and in contrast, South Africa, when I was here, everyone wore their mask. There wasn't political dissent against wearing masks. Everyone recognized that mask wearing worked, and it kept people safe. And despite the poverty, the people living in very close conditions, and a health system that's under-resourced, despite all that, South Africa navigated the pandemic in a much, much more successful way than the United States did. So that's a tribute to Ramaphosa and a tribute to the South African people.
No, absolutely. And I think that if you if you look at the South African scientists who were at work, they were given pride of place when the president would only speak after he had won consensus from his science council. He didn't put our equivalent of Dr. Fauci in the awkward space of having to watch the show. Our Dr. Fauci's were the show. They were listened to. And it puts an enormous burden on them, because as health scientists, they had to both weigh up the health impacts as well as the economic impacts. And so we were always calibrating, never trading off the one against the other. We never made economic livelihoods the be all and end all, nor did we make health indicators the be all and end all. It was finding the common ground between the two, because lives and livelihoods are equally important it should be in the world, but it certainly was in South Africa. And we had empathetic leadership from President Ramaphosa. He was at his finest. Mm-hmm. And it was because the factions of the ANC were banned. There were no ANC meetings taking place. It was because the people were confined to their houses. The criminals were banned. Alcohol was banned from being sold. And for the first time, our health facilities did not creak under the burden of stab wounds and gunshot wounds and fights and domestic violence that were alcohol induced. And so people understood that they needed to make those sacrifices.
I'm going to ask one more question, then we're going to start having some questions from the audience. Obviously, in the United States, with the mass shootings that have occurred recently, I've had lots of people in South Africa ask me about gun control in the United States, why there isn't gun control in the United States, why we aren't doing more about gun violence in the United States. Could you talk a little bit about gun ownership in South Africa and gun control and mass shootings in South Africa? Because to my knowledge, there aren't mass shootings. There certainly are murders. There certainly is violence, but it's violence at a different level than we experience in the United States. Why is that?
Look, I think that there is significant degrees of gun control in South Africa. Background checks, gun licenses, training certificates to use the gun, valid reasons to have a gun, etc., are all in place, and it has to be renewed every few years. It's not a forever right that you have. I think red lines in that would be mental history and political backgrounds that are absolutely crucial as well. And then also, there is no free sale of heavy weapons. I think that there's a big hunting community in South Africa and they know what they need for it, but there's no automatic weapons. Who goes to kill an elephant with a AK-47 or a R1? And so I think that there's a proportionality in it. I think that South Africa is a country with significant anger issues. We are a traumatized nation. And a lot of the violence we have is interpersonal. It's people being struck with a hand, being punched. It's people often being stabbed with a sharp object or a knife. We do see, for example, that when a policeman has anger issues, the domestic violence is often a gunshot wound. When an ordinary person is engaged in domestic violence, it's a slap and a punch. In extreme cases, it is a knife wound. So you can buy the argument that people kill, but people kill with what is at hand. You see, we all walk around with anger issues, but we don't all walk around with AK-47s. We all walk around with grievances, but we don't have access to the weapons of social destruction. And so you can't choose the primary perpetrator as being the unstable person and that the weapon is incidental. An unstable person with a knife at best kills 2 people. An unstable person with an automatic weapon kills more. And I remember making a joke when interviewed by a radio station in Charlotte during the 2012 Democratic National Convention. And I had just been in a meeting with President Obama and his wife, Michelle. And they asked me about weapons policies in South Africa. And I said to them, I think the only one in the United States who has the right to bear arms would be Michelle Obama.
That's very good. Okay, so Matthew, there's a question from the audience.
Ambassador and Professor, thank you so much. We have a few questions coming in from the audience. One question, Ambassador, asks about South Africa's opinion on the current Russia-Ukraine conflict and the United States' role in it. What view has South Africa expressed?
South Africa has chosen that there should be mediation between the two sides. South Africa, at the governmental level, I think some people believe that enlarging NATO is a provocation. And basically, in the same way that the United States in 1962 under President Kennedy had the right to say, I don't want missile bases at my soft underbelly in Cuba, and blockaded it. In much the same way, I think there are South Africans who give that benefit of the doubt to Putin as well, to say, but what is unequivocal is that national sovereignty of Ukraine is sacrosanct. Fighting and invading Ukraine is a no-no. You may understand the reasons, but you don't cross certain red lines. And therefore, I think that we must be able to hold two ideas in our heads at the same time. The one is that we should not do provocation because we don't like provocation done unto us. The other one is that national sovereignty, people's lives, and the sovereign space of a particular country and nation must remain sacrosanct. So I think it's a much more half a dozen of one and six of the other.
Ambassador, thank you. We have another question that's come in about China's role on the African continent. We've had some programs recently at the IRC talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and China's ambitions around the world. What has Chinese engagement looked like in South Africa in recent years, especially in terms of the infrastructure development that you're talking about?
Look, on any good day, getting Chinese investments and infrastructure projects going is infinitely easier than getting its equivalent from the United States. No one has a doubt that some of the infrastructure developments from the United States has been qualitatively good. It has empowered South Africans. And again, I use, for example, the fact that the building of the Kusile power station by under guidance, engineering guidance of Black and Veatch has meant that the training of a new generation of South African engineers resulted in it. Often what would happen with a Chinese infrastructure project is that they may even bring their own engineers and their own workers and leave very few skills behind. You may not even be sure of the quality of that undertaking. But for a country in trouble, in deep, urgent need, China is often the easiest way in which, because it asks fewer questions, it has fewer government loops that their decisions need to go through. And so it's very tempting to do that. On the other hand, I think China has also been a great commodity buyer, and we're all hoping that China gets out of its current COVID wave in order that they can resume buying commodities, because that may be a better kickstart to the South African and the African economy than, for example, dealing with the uncertainty of whether the African Growth and Opportunities Act in the United States will be continued after 2025, and should we be looking. So I think that on the one hand, it's governance processes. China doesn't have the same kind of governance processes. Secondly, it's the uncertainty about whether things like AGOA will continue or not, or whether you take the bird in hand rather than the bird in the bush approach. And then I think South Africans and Africans are very cognizant of the fact of what the difficulties are with Chinese investments, such as their own labor versus developing our labor. But I think we are often in great urgent need of immediate interventions as opposed to those on the longer burner of the United States.
Ambassador, thank you. In the US, we've been following a number of developments around the European Union, but the African Union is much less well known in the United States. How would you characterize the African Union and its effectiveness, and what is South Africa's relationship with the African Union?
South Africa, to a large extent, was the inspiration for the African Union. I think particularly if Nelson Mandela was the moral inspiration for Africa to come together, then Thabo Mbeki was the architect of Africa. He was the arch-Africanist, understanding that Americans may not always know geography very well, and therefore who judge whether to invest in South Africa by a conflict in Mauritania, which is thousands of miles away. And so he understood, rather than teach Americans and Europeans geography, let us get Africa right. It may be easier. And so I think South Africa has gone about, you know, in the time of Mandela, we probably had 5 mediations going. In the Great Lakes, the deputy president was involved. In Rwanda, we had a minister. In Sudan, we had another minister. Mandela himself was working on some of the other conflicts because we understood that Africa needs peace as the precondition for its development. And so peace became the very important thing, and South Africa was driving a lot of it. Then good governance. And again, we introduced the African peer review mechanism, which then said, these are the standards of government and governance. And then we had election after election in Africa. We banned coup d'etats and all of those kind of things in the golden age of doing that. Then we said, but what are we inviting investment for? And so the new plan for Africa's development was the brainchild of Thabo Mbeki, Bouteflika, and Wade in Senegal. And suddenly the world understood our priorities in ranked orders: energy, infrastructure, etc., connectivity, telephone connectivity. And again, that became a way. I was very fortunate in 2014 to participate in President Obama's convening of the US-Africa Leaders Summit, in which almost all 54 African presidents came to Washington and for 3 days not only sat with President Obama in developing things like Power Africa, extending AGOA, deepening the AIDS program, PEPFAR, etc. But that was the time when major US pharmaceuticals, even from Kansas City, engineering firms like Black & Veatch, major companies all came and were engaging African presidents for it. And so that was probably the high point of activity between Africa and the United States. And then an unfortunate event happened when we became the so-called S-hole countries in the imagination of the White House. And the momentum that was built up out of that got lost. And nature does not leave a vacuum. When a vacuum like that, which was being filled systematically out of the US-Africa Leaders Summit, when that vacuum opened up, you can't then complain. I always say Cosby, Stills, and Nash taught us a wonderful song. If you can't be with the one you love the one you're with. And China was with us during that vacuum. And so, but to end, the good news is that the African Continental Free Trade Agreement is now launched. Over 50 countries have signed up. What this means is that you probably will end up with one customs union. If you enter in South Africa, your customs are paid, you don't pay it again. The infrastructure program to move goods is being put in place. The banking systems are aligned largely on the basis of South Africa's 5 largest banks being Africa's 5 largest banks. South African and other companies have created so much cellular connectivity. When I came to the United States, I was surprised to see that the bank gave me a checkbook in 2010, whereas in South Africa, we were graduating already to online transactions on our phones. And that's what's really taking place. We skipped the whole fixed line phase in South Africa, in Africa. So I really think that the great opportunity for Americans is going to be the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. President Biden can't be mired in domestic priorities only. If he wants to open up avenues of trade and investment for American companies, don't only look to Europe, it's saturated. Don't compete in China, it's saturated. Africa is the virgin territory, and it's becoming easier and easier to do business here in Africa.
And just to follow up on that point, if the United States and Europe doesn't move into Africa, China already is, and it will only continue. And given all of the incredible natural resources there are, minerals, there will come a day when we in the United States will be very sad that we let China buy up so many of the minerals in Africa, because that's what they're doing right now. And we are asleep at the switch. And so I think changing our foreign policy and making sure that Africa is an important part of that would be wise for the United States. Otherwise, we will lose out in the long run. Matthew, is there another question from the audience?
Well, as we come down to our final moments here, Ambassador, we do have a question from a friend of yours from Black and Veatch, Shahid Qadri, an IRC board member, who would like to know what are the 2 top things South Africa should be doing to turn things around, and how can the United States help?
I think, Shahid, it's great hearing from you, even if it is via Matthew. But thank you very much for your help in making this a reality tonight. And your anxiety was misplaced about whether I will remember the date or not. But the 2 top things: South Africa has to win the trust and the admiration of the world again. Maybe South Africa can teach a lesson that says we got ourselves into trouble with self-inflicted blows. Let us now show the world how we recover. Maybe in that could be a modest lesson for the United States. How does the US recover from a decade or more of populism? How does the US recover from a polarized political situation? And maybe South Africa can be inspiring again, but it will take hard work. It started. We've got to put people in jail without fear or favor. If we don't start prioritizing accountability, we will be institutionalizing impunity. It will become part of the fabric. If we don't restore the institutions of South Africa to their former glory, whether they are the economic institutions like Transnet, South African Airways, Eskom, etc., or whether they are the financial institutions like Treasury and the development finance institutions, whether they are the social institutions, we've got to restore the integrity of our institutions. I think every crisis, and this is the second point, every crisis is enormously difficult, but as Einstein said, in the middle of difficulty lies opportunity. Here is an opportunity for South Africa to say, when we improve and we renew and we purify ourselves, let's not do what we've done before. Let us now do what is different. How do we now use this crisis to kickstart the 4th industrial revolution and to create the digital base that South Africa requires? How do we move using the African Continental Free Trade Agreement to position South Africa as the gateway into the whole African opportunity, giving its way of life, its ease of doing business, its banking and judicial solidity, giving that to American and other companies in order for them to use this as the platform to utilize the African opportunity. So I think so we've got to look in and clean up and renew and rebuild our institutions. And secondly, we've got to look to Africa as the preeminent gateway for global companies, but particularly in this case, American and Western companies, to come in, have a soft landing, and then move into the African opportunity as we go forward. And I think, to the last part of your question, what should America do? America must understand, keep one eye on the domestic situation and keep the other eye on opportunities for Americans to do business in the rest of the world, particularly Africa. Don't be too inward looking, because you may miss the external opportunities.
Well, Ambassador, thank you so much. And Professor, thank you so much for a really meaningful and poignant conversation. Ambassador Rasool, as I think everyone heard, has joined us previously in Kansas City, and we will look forward, Ambassador, to your next visit. And Professor, we'll look forward to getting you back in Kansas City as well. And thank all of you for joining us today, whatever time zone you are in, for this conversation on what's happening in South Africa. We certainly look forward to the continuation of this series, as well as other IRC programs. Visit us online at irckc.org to learn more. Thank you again, and take care.
Thank you very much.